Yeah, please give them a hand as well. Then we just a bit of enthusiasm. All right, let me briefly introduce you. Rick, you're from Kantar. You're a sociologist, researcher, and we're going to talk about impact. What's impact for you? Just one line, one sentence.
Impact for me is showing that the interventions are successfully, and impact for me is...
It was more than enough.
Yeah,
they need to be successful. Okay, Nynke Tromp, you're an associate professor of the Delft University, looking into behavioral change.
Yeah.
What's impact for you?
Impact for me is showing that you did what you promised.
Nice one. Jop Japenga, Buitengewone Zaken. What is it for you?
For me, it sparks some change, either personally or on a system.
Looks like you all prepared this. Really good. Julia Veldman, you're a visual designer, storyteller. What's it for you?
I think giving people a sense of empowerment. That's impact to me.
Nice one. I will leave it to you now because you will present, you will present the case study Field Hacks, and then we'll go into a debate, a couple of dilemmas that you faced. So you will present the project, and then we'll have a nice discussion with all of you. So,
thank you. Yes, well, welcome everybody to this presentation and this panel discussion on measuring success. I will now grab the clicker because that will help do that. We just got introduced and moving on from there. My name is, as you heard, Meis, and together with Jop Japenga, Yus plus Manon, who are also here, and Arvid and Marie, we got invited by an open call from Field Hacks to go to Lesbos in Greece for a very specific project. This project will be the panel discussion study case, and they will not review it as a very, how do you call it, like a success story. They will review it as a starting project that we will discuss in our findings and how we struggle to do some things, how we concluded a couple of dilemmas, and moving on from there, hopefully draw some conclusions together. The Field Hacks open call was made by Baltan Laboratories, the Dutch platform, and Lotra in Greece, which is an NGO and design bureau. Let's see. Their call was basically just for creatives in the industrial design compartment, in the social design compartment, and name it, just in that field of expertise. And they selected 6 people to go, as I just explained who we were. We all came from very different backgrounds, and we went there with a completely blank state of mind, as much as we could do that. So the first thing that we did was we arrived to Lesbos, and on the first day of our 5-day field research trip, we familiarized ourselves with our context. Our context was a refugee camp specific for families. So it was one of the camps that was a little easier to approach than a lot of different camps. So that's something to keep in mind as I'm presenting to you how we went to work and what we did. After visiting the camp itself, which we were asked to phrase as the village and also view as the village, so from now on I will do that as well towards you. We went back into the studio that we had downtown, provided by Lotra, and we started looking for goals, because of course we had no goals going in there, being instructed to simply see what we would be immersing ourselves in. On the second day, we went into the field, basically, and found out that a lot of the people that lived in the village, they had been designing hacks for themselves, which of course triggered us being part of the Field Hacks team. So we tried to basically just select a lot of these hacks that we found inspiring. And then we went on to recreating some of them, adding to them, and seeing how we can, sorry, I got distracted for a second, and seeing how we can implement them back to the society that was living in this village. What we did was we made this this flyer, we made a little booklet, we went door to door from all the places where these people were living at that moment, and we invited them to engage, to bring their ideas, and we would show them their own ideas basically back to them. This provoked a lot of valuable conversation because we could knock on their door, which is a huge privilege to be able to do that in that context. We created a workshop together with them, as you can see here as well. One was for the men, one was for the women. And in this workshop, we started understanding really their thoughts of what they needed in the village and what they were looking for and what they had found already. After that, we documented all of it, and as you can see it here in this poster, we kind of divided the findings that we had into different areas of troubles that they were having and how they would solve them. And we used these ones to go back and reflect on the entire experience. Our reflections and documentation boiled down to us wondering, how do we proceed from here? We had a 5-day social design research project, and we would love to continue with it. The question is, what do we do? How can we use this information? And from our reflections, basically, we subtracted a couple of dilemmas, and these will be the dilemmas that will lay the grounds for this discussion. And feel free to move from them wherever you want, but these are our examples for this case study, and Daniela will explain them to begin with.
Right?
Yes.
Okay, well, you can all read. So the first one, what amount of knowledge or understanding of the context is needed to have an impact? And I think you already mentioned that you came in there blunt, without any knowledge, pretty blank actually.
Yeah.
How did you prepare?
Well, the most effort into preparing went into not trying to think about it. And in not thinking about it, we had to very quickly immerse ourselves into the ideas that we were getting, on the feelings that we were experiencing, on getting to know each other, because of course we didn't know each other either when we were going there, so we didn't know in what perspective everybody would be working and what their reason was to be there to begin with. And the question is kind of, is this a valuable way to do it, or does it cause any harm to do it that way, especially in a sensitive social design context where there's a lot at stake? So this is basically essentially the fuel for the first questions that we have, or the first dilemma that we faced.
Okay. Yeah, Nynke, if I could start indeed with you, is that the right approach to start like this?
I wanted to ask maybe a clarification because I didn't maybe got it, but who briefed this to you?
The briefing came from Baltan Laboratories and Latra in Greece together. Okay. It was an open call, and the briefing was just found there. And then as we went there, basically Latra laid down the idea to Baltan to do this. And
okay, and Latra and Baltan don't mean anything to me. What type of organizations are they?
Both two design organizations, one based in Eindhoven, one based in Greece.
Okay.
And they both set the brief for this. They
are design agencies.
Design research agencies.
A design bureau in Greece and / NGO, and Baltan Laboratories is a design platform based in Eindhoven.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the reason why you ask this?
Well, because I think it frames part of your impact, right? I mean, what type of organization is behind your activity? So what can you do with the results? I think that is an important framing for the brief, and something you should, I think, first think of before going there, because you also make some sort of a promise to the people who you come across, who you want to interview, who you want to improve their lives. So I think that's an important thing, and I think also the framing of hacking sort of means that you're trying to disrupt the power balance between them and the system. And I think you should also be aware of the fact that with doing so, you sort of fundamentally accept the system, or at least you're not trying to infiltrate in the system, but you're trying to oppose their power relation to the system, which also has consequences of the type of impact you want to generate. So I think those are in the brief, and they define the activities that you can do on the ground and the impact that you want to make.
I see you nodding, the two of you actually, Julia?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because I read, of course, the case study, and what sprang out to me is that you decided not to go with the communication problems between like the leading of the village and the people there that they were very worried about, but instead with how they could influence their direct surroundings in a way. And that's also why I came up with the word empowerment, because of course it can give you the sense of empowerment if you can influence your direct surroundings, but I think you should not shy away from trying to like really do something about these power relations in this situation. Of course, you're coming from outside, so it's super hard to do something about it. But sometimes it's a distraction to give people like a toy to play with to make them feel better if their situation is actually dire. But then on the other hand, what I thought was very beautiful is that you mentioned that people don't want to think of this place as their home. They want it to be somewhere that they will leave. But they will probably be there for years. And that's framing. And that's also why, of course, the naming of it, a village, is very important. But then like you rent a house and you live there for 5 years. It's kind of a similar time span. So, yeah.
Jop, you went there as well?
Yeah.
As a designer, just doing the research there. How did you prepare?
We didn't prepare that much, as Meis said, and the idea behind it was to really start from kind of the perceptions that arise in the context itself, and not based on like predefined assumptions that we had. And why I think it's an interesting topic also to discuss maybe in a wider setting is that I see some parallels to you know, the setting that we in other design projects also have. That in this case it's very obvious that there's like 6 people coming from across the continent dropped in this setting, and they have to kind of understand what's happening and how to deal with this or how to change this in a very short period of time. But I think in general, as social designers, you're always somewhat odd or new to the setting that you're working in, and you're always figuring out what can we do here, what should we do here, and sometimes, as you mentioned, you have clear goals, and they are related to, for instance, the organizations that you work with or that hire you. But sometimes I think it's also good to start from the topic or the change that you want, not based on values that you have beforehand, but based on what you get or see in the context itself.
But do I understand correctly that you also said there is this risk of being a bit condescending, of being a sort of post-colonial designer that brings all this knowledge and tools?
Yeah, definitely. So that's why we were very kind of, how to put it, aware of our role, and really try to not add too much, but really emphasize things that we saw or that were happening, and empowering people themselves. So I think that's kind of.
But the risk that Julia points out, I think, is a very, very valid one, right? That you start small, which has a human side to it, and you try to improve the things within the limits of where they are. But that makes it also more acceptable that they are there. You're kind of making the malfunctioning system work better, and that's I think something that's within the brief already up front, right?
Maybe, but I think we could have maybe broken out if we want. I think
depending on the insights that you generate.
Yeah, or what we found out there. But that's also a very delicate topic, because it's also dealing with the reality of these people. So you can try to change the system.
No, don't get me
together.
wrong. I don't
Yeah.
think it's therefore not worthwhile.
Yeah.
It's just that you have to frame your impact differently,
Yeah.
right? Then
And how
then
is
it's on
that-
an individual level
Yeah,
rather than you're
definitely.
trying to really create a power relationship, disrupt this power relationship.
And how is that different from being there as a design researcher, a designer, or you do these kind of projects as well as a sociologist? How is that different? Do you face these dilemmas?
Yeah, one of the things I was curious about. What would you have done if you had all the time and the money? Would you have extend your exploratory phase? Because normally, as a sociologist, I would do that. Like, take your time to really look at what are the triggers and barriers for a desired behavior, and let's pinpoint the insights, and then look which intervention could pin on that. That would I normally do.
Would
But
that
I'm
be
not
in
sure
a,
if it's-
would that be a possibility, even Mes?
Like in a realistic sense within the Field Hacks project, it is something that we're looking into, and that is being looked into. And I think something surrounding the phrasing that is also good to keep in context is that the initial idea of this project was going into humanitarian aid and seeing it from an innovation perspective. So how can you rephrase the context of having people lined up, giving them blankets, and that being the type of aid that you give them, and how is there a way to approach that power balance differently. So this is basically how we familiarized ourselves with the context, and from there on we're moving on.
Yeah, I like the approach, but also one thing I'm curious about is also the definition of impact. Like, as a sociologist, if you really want to make impact, you have to compare results with something. So in the end, I'm not sure how can you define success. What was the additional effect of your intervention? As a researcher, I would say you had to do some measurements, a pre-measurement and a post-measurement, and see what is the effect. And I'm not sure, did it cross your minds to integrate the research part, or?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure, but I'll give the word on that to Jop.
Yeah, I think you also asked, what if we had all the time in the world? I think if you look at impact, there's clearly a difference between, like you also mentioned, like a personal or situational impact, or impact to really change the system that surrounds it. And I think to start from these very explorative small experiments, it's very valuable to start in the situation, and maybe you have some situational impact. But then afterwards, in order to really change the system, I agree that it's good to have like clear set goals and ways to measure whether what you do actually help you accomplish those goals or not. But I think it's very difficult to do that at the same time, to be explorative and to be kind of validating.
But
at the
did
same
you get
time.
like next steps? What will happen after this?
Yeah, we had a few, and
I think we will get into that, right, in a second. But
maybe
at
it's
least
better for
that's
later. Yeah.
on my list. Are there any questions or any advices from you how to deal with this dilemma?
I have a question.
Yeah.
The involvement of the people there. Like, how did you involve the people there? Because I hear you talk about improving the hacks that they already created, and you decided to improve the hacks that they already had. So why did you improve the hacks, and did you actually take the people within the design process?
Yeah.
Anyone who likes to answer that?
I can answer. We invited everyone, and that was kind of more like the workshop setting. So we went door by door to ask what people changed themselves, and if it was something that they wanted to share with their neighbors. And then together, amongst themselves and their neighbors and us, we kind of looked for how could this be applied in different ways, or how would your neighbor like to change this for himself, or well, those kind of things.
I think what's interesting to know about it too is that these these places are also divided in different cultures. So you think of a refugee as a refugee and that's it, but these are all different people and they also come from different cultures. And what we noticed was that not only are we outsiders, but they are also kind of separated from each other. So you have ideas at the bottom of the village, because it went up. So say at the bottom of the village, you had mostly the Afghan community. They worked in a different way to create their homes, so to speak, as people who were from another country and had more of a irrigation background or whatever. So we were trying basically to learn these differences and see in what way we can merge their own ideas and our own ideas to become one big thinking pot, basically.
Nynke, if I can ask you, because you mentioned you also need to know really well the system you're operating within. What would be your advice? You already mentioned, well, see if you can extend and dive really into the issue, but is there anything you should do, a list of activities or tips you could share?
I would consider, like, if you're involved in social design, my definition is that you primarily want to foster the common good, so the things that are playing at a collective level. And there are more specific forms in that. So you might want to focus on the underprivileged and really have, out of compassion do your design activities. Or you want to, like the project that Nele showed, is more to make NGOs or public organizations more responsive. So what is the key value that drives your activities? And then try to see if the activities actually lead to outcomes that foster this type of value. You need to somehow know what you're doing, right? And I agree that you can be exploratory, but then that shifts from maybe an open exploratory stage to, okay, we want to have this knowledge base or this kind of platform of ideas. But if that's the idea, what do you think that you want to contribute? Well, how does it contribute and how can you measure that? I think that is a very important step we as social designers really need to make. Yeah.
And would there be like a minimum to that for you? I mean, like for instance, we had 5 days now. Would you say don't bother doing any project under a year or 3 years or a certain amount of time? Because
we listened to Matthijs this
like
morning
Matthijs,
just now.
Pointed out.
Yeah. I think 5 days is really, really short. I wouldn't know. I wouldn't even. I didn't get any information about the case, by the way. So I'm kind of on the slides, like, what is this about? But of course, every social design has probably long-term goals, right? Long-term objectives. You want to increase respect for diversity in a society, or belongingness, or all these kind of vague, ambiguous social phenomena. And you have to sort of trace back, okay, how is the intervention? What's my theory of change? What will my intervention do in the short term? How does this relate to other effects that in the end give me faith that I will do something good to those social phenomena? And that theory of change for the longer term, you should rely a lot on theory and social theories, and there are a lot of sociologists that have theories that we can make use of. And the short-term one, you need to measure as objectively as possible. And then you need to be keen on the negative side effects. So you have a goal, you have a sort of dot on the horizon, but we have done a lot of harm previously in our profession. So you should also, okay, if I do something here, who might get the negative consequences of that? If I intervene here, who's gonna...
But if we listen to you correctly, your advice would actually be don't go there for 5 days, right?
I didn't know it was 5 days, so I need to pause, but I was like, oh, would I go? I don't know. Okay.
Yeah, but you probably had the idea or the courage to think you could make an impact in 5 days. It didn't bother you or didn't block you to go there?
I don't think it's that easily said.
Instigating a debate here.
Yeah, what it is more is we all had our personal reasons to figure out if we can help set up this project that hopefully can be an ongoing long-term thing. The starting point was this field research, and yes, that was 5 days, but in these days, like, we all had to rephrase our ideas of why we were there and how we were going to connect to each other. And speaking of impact, that was something that we had to think of with every single step that we made constantly, because we only had such a limited time. So it's actually something that we want to get into as well. with the next dilemma that we face. So it's good that the conversation was steered this way. I can go on to it. As you can see, the second one is, to what extent do we need barriers around our experimentation in order to prevent negative impact? Because with the time limit that we had to think of, okay, are we just going to bulldoze over everything to gather as much information from this context as possible? Or are we going to be very careful because we want to treat people with a certain respect and they're not subjects in our experiment? So we kind of went back and forth between having to refine our interactions and our motivations. So proposing this question, would you say that we need barriers, basically, or would you say the barrier should have been up front, where you familiarize before you go to the field?
Let me start with Rick answering this.
I think it's really difficult to see through in front of your research what will be the negative side effects and what will be. So I think you should keep your eyes open for negative side effects or negative effects. That's one of the things, because in realistic evaluation, when it's not a laboratory setting, you can't control everything. I've done a lot of research as well.
But you do set barriers, right? What would you do in such a case?
I would keep my eyes open for the barriers. I can give you an example of another evaluation I did. I was involved in the evaluation of the weed pass, something totally different. It's about preventing tourists to buy marijuana in the coffee shop. They needed a membership card. And one of the negative side effects was that the owners of the coffee shops, they totally sabotaged this system because they didn't want to lose their profit. So they paid local drug dealers to sell soft drinks on the street in front of their coffee shops, and they invited media to film it. You could never have seen it beforehand that it could have happened. The only thing you could have done is look at the different point of views of the local actors, and that's the one thing you could do. But the other thing you could do is keep your eyes open during your research part.
Okay, so keep your eyes open. We already had the time barrier. Yeah. Julia, anything else?
I think this is so hard. I have to think about an inventor in the 50s, Thomas Midgley. He single-handedly invented two of the most toxic elements ever. One of them caused the whole ozone layer. The other one was the idea to put lead in gasoline to make motors run smoother and longer because of that. He eventually invented a machine to lift himself from the bed and killed himself with it. So I just think, just to say, you can have great intentions and it totally ruins things. And like last speaker also said, don't be idealistic.
But do you say these unintended consequences is not something you should worry about up front?
Not too much, no. I don't think so. Because there's probably a lot of people trying to do terrible things that end up doing good things by mistake.
Everyone agrees?
There's another interesting point to get on here where, because there is a chance that we will go back, not to the same camp even, but there are different ways to proceed from what we did. We kind of also had a moment to look at each other and say, well, mistakes help us learn, right? So what if we just go ahead and we, for example, had a couple of mistakes happen in our process and we had to very carefully and very rapidly deteriorate from them to be able to continue with these same people. But what if that wasn't on our scale? What if we would say, you know what, we're just going to make all the mistakes in this camp, learn from them, and take our knowledge to the next camp? That's our village, excuse us. But that's something that also kind of shapes your perspective on, do you really need these barriers? And I feel like you two are saying not exactly the same there, and we are struggling with it to know how to morally, adapt this
and that's
part.
the idealistic thing. If you want to, you don't want to make mistakes because it's real people. But then, how do you make progress?
Is there a way in between, Nynke, to deal with that? Doing experiments in a social setting, but learning from these mistakes as well?
No, I don't know. I think I mean, you want to achieve something, and therefore you need to take risks. I do think that as soon as you try to implement something, that there should be a commitment to see how it plays out. And of course, as a designer, you can work with prototypes to test out a lot of things on the short term, at least. I had to think of Airbnb. I think when it was launched, everybody was like, "Whoa, this is a great platform. It makes so much use of good resources, and there's even some social opportunity there to meet new people." And in the end, we have a lot of city centers now that are being empty. There are no citizens anymore. And I think if they were a real social design agency, they would try to change that. And they're not doing that. So I think then, that makes a difference between a designer and
But then I think that's a pretty good example, because with Airbnb, you say there are a lot of unintended consequences. So now they're looking into a fair B&B to see if you can repair for these mistakes.
Yeah, or to discourage the behaviors
exactly.
that you don't want to
So it
happen.
evolves along the time. It brings in new stakeholders. And I think that might be something interesting to look at, because now it were 6 designers, right? Working there together with the people. But who else did you bring into this conversation and in the hacks?
Well, the other parties involved in this village, that also, these are NGOs that operate in most of the villages around there. So yeah, we're definitely scaling up, and I think it has different perspectives. So you could look at the sector, and like you mentioned, how to innovate in the humanitarian sector. I think that's a completely different track to explore and to see what can we learn from our experiences and how can we proceed. Then the situation and the setting there, where there's also how can we implement this in like the things that are already there and the people that are already there, and how can we make it durable there. So for instance, there's one shop set up in the village that people come to if something's broken. So that was kind of our ideal place to kind of empower to continue.
But if I were you, I would really try to make my agenda a bit more ambitious and try to see, okay, how can I use this to actually fundamentally change how we deal with refugees, right? You don't want to encourage a system in which people are in a refugee camp for 5 years. So the more interventions you do to make that a sort of human form, the more you underscore the system as it is. So for me, I would use this, but I would step up my game.
Yeah, no, but that's what I mean. I think you have to operate in different levels, and in the context in which you experiment, you have to be there and really make sure that you are continuously there to also prevent possible negative impact on the long run that you didn't foresee. And at the same hand, you can kind of distract your learnings and project them on larger scale change.
Yeah, but not necessarily in the I would not go for the horizontal scaling, but for the political
no, definitely.
scaling.
Yeah.
Okay, before moving into the third dilemma, is anyone else has a different opinion on this? There's some great ideas we can bring in this discussion. Yeah?
Well, one of the things that I'm having problem with is the impact it frames already in a problem-solving mode, rather than transformation could frame it differently. So what is the order of change rather than the notion of measuring, and because then you have to go into the world, the notion of realism, where there's an external world there that exists already, and we can empirically find that. And then we can say what exists now, and then we can measure later what exists later, and then we could talk about impact. But that's not future forming. That's not finding what's possible. Which is the orientation of design. It is what is tomorrow and what can be made here with the people. So it is from the earth, the soil of their being, that creation comes out. And as designers, we are conduits. We are carrying that tradition and culture with us. We bring it as how we do, yeah? And then we are being responsive and relational to them. Hey, here's a hack. That's cool. And then you got to reflect it back. You said it at the beginning. You reflected it back. You got conversation then. Then you got the workshop. Then you learned their needs. Then knowing those people, starting to get to know their culture and knowing the different cultures, you are responsive. Then you can see what's possible. Man, that's design.
Wow. Yeah, please do. Yeah. So, but if I did understand you correctly, you mentioned do not focus so much on the impact, but on the transformative practice and yeah.
Frames it in a traditional reductionist scientific approach.
Anyone would like to respond to that?
That what you mentioned, because you mentioned framing, and there's a lot of framing in this whole situation. You start with, we need to call this camp a village. And the case study says the people don't want to see it as their village, they don't want to live there, they want to leave. So you're already in this box that they don't want to be in, and so we decide to call it a village now. So they live here. It's not a passing station. And yeah, what you mentioned as well, actually you're solidifying that the concept of that this is kind of a solid state that it will be in for a long time, while they don't want that at all. So yeah.
What I did get from your presentation, Meis, is that you were a bit on the fence about that yourself as well, right? You mentioned deliberately, like, I'm going to mention it as a village.
But later you call it a camp again.
Yeah. Yes, and I can say that freely because camp management is not here today. No, it's actually interesting because they did say to us, look, when we made the flyer, we had a different phrasing, and they said, no, this is how we thought about it, and we know that for our system, this works. So for us, it's really not about who's right and who's wrong. For me, my rebellion that I feel comes from a very personal place. I speak the language. I came as a refugee myself, so I had a whole different way of approaching that, and I had to let that go. And we all had to let these personal ideas go because it's all about the process. How do you implement your design process as efficiently as possible in the context that we were working in? So that's why we were very fast, like submissive to, okay, you know what, we're going to phrase it that way, and hopefully we're doing the right thing, kind of like that.
Okay, I think Rick has some concerns with that.
Yeah, not only that, but I felt also a little bit spoken through to the lady in the over here, because I think I'm the one who's approaching this in a scientific way, but to put on the other side, I've seen a lot of creative ideas in the last 10 or 13 years, and in the end, it was my duty, my job to conclude they didn't change behavior at all. So if we don't do it a little bit systematically, society isn't going to change with all the creative ideas, especially. Knowledge is okay to change the knowledge. Attitude, they changed a lot, but with all the campaigns and behavior change projects I evaluated, behavior change, changing behavior, not only on the short term, but on the long term, it's really difficult. And if you don't do it systematically, you won't know it at all. And it's only going to be creative ideas and good intentions.
That's a good one, but I think, well, the reason you put up also a conference like this is a way of systematically looking at these case studies. So I think you did a brave job in bringing up this case and critically reflect on that. So I think knowledge is building.
Yeah.
Thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah.
But I thought you were also critically about your comment that you bring yourself in this project, but then leave all that there, sort of being neutral there. And I think that's pretty problematic, especially in your case. Isn't it that you always bring yourself? Nynke, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah,
I
I'm
think
also a little bit puzzled about the input of the lady, because I think there are many forms, many types of social design, and I think this is one of them. You sit with people locally, and you really try to be as humane as possible and see opportunities for them to make a better tomorrow, which is something completely different, like the redesigning psychiatry project in which you want to, completely fundamentally change the mental health care sector. Those are two opposites of a range of social design activities, and I think with the type of activity that you are involved in, the level of impact that you are aiming for / need to measure if you want to show that you're successful is different.
Okay, let's bring in the third dilemma, the final one.
All right,
then we need some drinks.
The final one. Oh, I like how everybody's going there. I will read it to you. How to deal with the inherent power balance between designer and participants. So what we essentially mean with this is we go there and there is a power balance from us as designers, viewed as humanitarian helpers, basically. Then we have the other NGOs who are working there, who have a whole different process. You have the camp management, who has a whole different... and there's all these power balances between us and the people that we are working with, basically. The question there is kind of, how to deal with it.
Anyone?
Yeah, what I think is interesting, maybe view it a bit wider, but as a design researcher or social designer, you're always trying to, involve as many people or get people on board, and sometimes that becomes kind of an aim in itself. And I think you have to be very aware of the fact that it's not just about that. So in this case, we were discussing amongst ourselves, what if we were quite happy with the engagement we got, but we were not sure if it was because of what we were doing or because of our skin color. And so in that sense, we were wondering, is that a problem or not? Because also in other projects, sometimes we use kind of tricks or ways to engage people with the topic or with the research we're doing. And is that okay? Or do you always want to engage people? How far should you go to try to engage them? That's kind of my question. I'm wondering how you...
Something to keep in mind, for example, in our case, what we had to think about was, okay, so we were, as Jop said, very pleased with the level of participation and interaction that we were able to establish there. But say that we would have been there for a longer period of time, and people would have noticed that really our focus in this research was the village itself. What participation would have, gone back, and how valuable was the participation or the conclusions drawn from the participation early on, for example?
It reminds me of a research I did on behalf of the Immigration Service in the Netherlands. We went to a lot of asylum seeker centers, and we interviewed a lot of refugees, people who lived there. And one of the issues, I think it's an ethical issue for me as well, is the response was really high. They really want to participate in this study because there's not a lot to do over there. But also, they're trying to convince me why I should look at their individual case. And it wasn't my purpose. I explained what was my purpose. It's like I'm going to do research and you're going to help other people with it because we can improve the service. But it's really difficult to explain to people who are not used to research and are not used to questionnaires and not used to the purpose of, I think, in Western society of researches. So it's an ethical issue, I think.
Yeah, but then you mentioned, Jop, that normally you would come up with means to engage people in, and now you almost mention you sort of withhold yourself of doing that because you're in such a delicate situation. Did I understand that correctly?
No, I think we look at like the interaction that you have. I think it always should be valuable in itself. So the impact that it has on people should be fine as it is for them as well as for me. That's my personal view. But
why? I wonder because so you in the case study it said that the women were most represented in the people that you worked with in the end. Is that something that you regret? Would you like to have other people from the camp participate more, and is there part of how you engage with them that had this result, you think?
No, I think it's fine as it was in that sense. I don't have a specific...
No, because I think it was telling, and I think if you have like this principle that the interaction itself has to be valuable, I totally get that, because it's so meaningful whenever you do something crazy like I did. I started a boy band to get Britain back to the EU, and for me personally, the best results were the conversation I had with Brexiteers on the street. And that because it was so funny, it was disarming, and we did get to have an actual discussion about something that was very hard to discuss at still, because it's so divided. But then I'm not sure if that is the thing that has the most impact in the end. Like you said, you don't need to scale horizontally, but vertically. In the end, you want. I would have liked Theresa May to serenade. By the way, yeah. So, yeah, it's more a question than a comment. On
Anyone
this.
in the audience who likes to respond to that? No, I get a cue. We need to go into the break. I think it's about time indeed to have some drinks. We will not, I think, come up with solid answers to your dilemmas, but I think you had an interesting conversation. So thank you for sharing all your knowledge and dilemmas. So please give them a hand.
Thank you.